Hello, welcome to the channel Flesh to the Father. Today's video I'm going to be explaining why the ego death doesn't exist. Now the reason I'm doing this video is because I've been just watching a few videos on people talking about ego death, and it's something I think is slightly misunderstood. And the point I'm trying to make is ego death isn't really real. What's truly happening is that their spirit is being awakened, or in terms of when people do psychedelics or have mystical spiritual experiences, is that they're temporary realizing that there's more to this life than the physical realm. So they have some kind of spiritual experience, which they describe as an ego death, but it's not really an ego death. They're just realizing they're awakening the spirit, or they're understanding that there's a spiritual realm. Now, the ego is basically our identity in this world and our physical body. That adds up to our ego in a way. And the only time our ego will die is when we leave this world, and our spirit that inhabits our body will go back to the Father, whilst our body and our egotistic identity that's when we will be truly released from it, and we will truly have the ego death. And for example, I'll see some people say, oh yes, I had an ego death 3 weeks ago. This woman on a YouTube video was saying it. And I was thinking, well, you can't have an ego death. It's impossible to have an ego death until you leave this world, because the ego will always exist, and the ego isn't bad. There's nothing wrong with the ego. But the goal of life is to have a spiritual awakening, which all spiritual things teach. And Jesus said, you must be born again as a spirit. And in Buddhism, they teach that you need to become enlightened. In Hinduism, they say you need to awaken the inner self. So all spiritual teachings have taught about a spiritual awakening. And what happens is you realize that you're a spirit, and then you're guided from the spirit rather than the ego. And that is the goal of life. It's not to have an ego death, because it's impossible. It's to have a spiritual awakening. And then you live and are guided by the spirit rather than the flesh and the ego. And just for an example would be, if I went to the doctors and the doctors said, Michael, you have cancer, you have 2 weeks to live. That if I lived only by the ego, I would be scared, upset, and very depressed. I've only got 2 weeks to live. But because I've had a spiritual awakening, my spirit overtakes the ego, and my spirit knows it's eternal. So it will say, okay, no worries. It's not depressing, it's not sad, and I'm not going to be scared. And another analogy would be, if I claim to be religious, let's say I said, my ego said I'm a Christian, or I'm a Muslim and I believe in the Christian teachings, or I believe in the Muslim teachings. But then if I awaken my spirit through spiritual work, I realize that I'm a spirit, and that all these religious beliefs and identities are part of an ego, which is part of the trap. And once I awaken my spirit, I realize, the Muslim or Christian beliefs are just part of this world and a part of the mind. And when I die, it will disappear, and that I'll return to the spirit. And in the spirit, there's no ego and there's no religions. So there's no Christians, there's no Muslims, there's no Jews in the spirit. So the spirit always shines a light on the ego. And the ego, again, it's not bad, it's not evil, but it's not helpful. If you only live as an ego and you haven't awakened the spirit, then you're going to be afraid of death. You're going to blindly believe in religions and cause division, and it's going to cause you trouble. You're going to live for sex, food, drugs, rather than the happiness and the joy of the spirit. Okay, so that's the point of this video, to explain that the ego death is not really the goal. The goal is to have a spiritual awakening, and then allow that spirit to guide the ego through life, in a similar way that it says the mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible slave. So you make the ego your slave rather than being a slave to the ego. Okay, so usual stuff. If you have any comments, put them below, and subscribe for more, and God bless everyone. Goodbye.